evening and welcome to Jefferson and Douglass, a conversation. I'm Allison Ramsey, the president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, and on behalf of our board, staff, and our volunteers, we're thrilled to welcome you here tonight. Tonight's conversation between Jefferson and Douglass will be followed by an audience Q&A, so if you have a question, please hold it until the end of the performance. I'd like to take a minute to quickly thank our sponsors, Trust and Wealth Management, the City of Lynchburg, the Greater Lynchburg Community Foundation, Progress Printing, Overstreet Rentals, the News in Advance, and finally, all of us at Poplar Forest want to thank the Academy Center of the Arts for restoring this beautiful theater and for inviting Poplar Forest to be a member of their residency program. Thank you to their staff and volunteers for all of their assistance with tonight's performance. Now, to introduce tonight's interpreters, Fred Morsell's professional acting career spans the past 40 years and includes seasons with several regional theaters across America. He has extensive background in film and television and has performed leading roles in 21 operas. Acclaimed across the United States for his portrayal of Frederick Douglass, Mr. Morsell has performed his play, Presenting Mr. Frederick Douglass, at many nationally recognized sites, colleges, churches, regional theaters, and schools. He also conducts the Frederick Douglass Seminars of Race Relations and Gender Equity through his nonprofit 501c3 corporation, Freemarrow Enterprises Incorporated. Bill Barker has portrayed Thomas Jefferson in a variety of settings for over 30 years. A historian who was attracted to the stage at an early age, Barker was cast as Jefferson in many different venues, including the musical 1776. The professional actor, director, and producer, who is the same height and weight as Jefferson and has the same general appearance, has portrayed Jefferson at Colonial Williamsburg and now portrays him at Monticello. He has performed as Thomas Jefferson at Poplar Forest, Monticello, the White House, and the Palace of Versailles, at numerous venues throughout the United States, Great Britain, and France, and on numerous television programs. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's MC, Jeff Taylor. Jeff Taylor has over 35 years' experience in broadcasting, management, communication, marketing, and public relations. He has worked in both radio and television and had news stories appear on such programs as Good Morning America, World News Tonight, and Nightline. He has been the MC for this event since 2000 and will be back at the end of the performance to take questions from the audience. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Taylor, and I hope you all really enjoy the evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Give Allison a great big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is quite an honor. It seems like I've gotten a lot older in the last 2 years. This is the first time I've had on a coat and tie and leather shoes in 2 years. It's great to see you all. Isn't this wonderful? Thank you for coming. I see some old friends and I see some new folks, so I'm glad you're all here. 2 years is too long to wait. So thank you for coming. A couple of things. First, I need for you to all take out your cell phones and turn them off. Not put them on silence, turn them off, please. Now, once you leave tonight, I want everyone to take those delicious charcuterie boxes that you got with you and dispose of them properly. This is a beautiful facility, and we want to keep it that way, isn't it? Let's give a big round of applause to the Academy for holding this thing. Uncomfortable conversations. We're going to have one tonight. I think you may be uncomfortable. It's not just a part of history. Uncomfortable conversations are history, and we haven't had enough of them. We're going to talk about slavery, the state of being a slave, the practice or system of owning slaves. Slavery is any system in which principles of property law are applied to people, allowing individuals to own, buy, and sell other individuals as a form of property. A slave is unable to withdraw unilaterally from any such arrangement and works without remuneration. As uncivilized as slavery is, it dates back from many cultures for many thousands of years to early civilizations. From the beginning of the first settlement on the shore of Virginia to the founding days of our country in the late 1700s, to the darkest days of this country in the 1860s, to the turbulent 1960s, and all the way to this 21st century, slavery has been a wound that has been unable to heal. And if it does ever heal, it's going to leave a hell of a scar. A scar so powerful that it should show us how not to treat human beings. Tonight, we have an exceedingly rare opportunity to see, hear, and for you at the end to participate in an uncomfortable conversation between a slave owner and a former slave. The slave owner, a founding father and the third president of our country, who is credited with writing, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And that man is Thomas Jefferson. And a former slave who escaped, became a national leader in the abolitionist movement, and was hailed for his eloquent speeches and incisive anti-slavery writings, who, when radical abolitionists criticized his eagerness to engage in dialogue with slave owners, replied, "I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong." And that is Frederick Douglass. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Honorable Frederick Douglass and President Thomas Jefferson. Ladies and gentlemen. Gentlemen, watch your heads there. Good evening, Mr. President.
Good evening, Mr. Taylor.
You know, I was noticing you were talking with Mr. Douglass coming down the aisle there, and would you tell us what you guys have been talking about? Did he ask you any questions, or you ask him any questions that, as you were coming down before you joined us tonight?
Well, yes, and truth be told, I simply asked Mr. Douglass, with only a few moments of having met one and the other, so what happened after July 1826?
As I told Mr. President Jefferson, when he decided to move to other realms of activity and existence, I was only 8 years of age or thereabouts, 7, 8, 9, I wasn't quite sure, because I never knew when my birthday was, typical for most slaves. But shortly thereafter, in the 1830s, after I had been living with my master for a few years, and he had sent me to Baltimore to live with relatives of his, and I resided with them for about 5 or 6 years. And then sometime around 1836, I went back to the eastern shore of Maryland and became a field hand. And fortunately, a year or so after that, I was able to return back to the family in Baltimore, and about a year or so later, on the 3rd of September, 1838, Mr. President, I was successful in escaping from slavery. I had met a free black woman. She was a very lovely lady by the name of Anna Murray. And one thing led to another, and as you can imagine, we grew fond of each other. She wanted me to escape from slavery. Of course, I had no means by which I could do so. So she sold some of her personal items. With that money, I was able to effect an escape via the Underground Railroad, which, as I'm sure you know, was trains, secret houses, and so on and so forth. I arrived in the city of New York on the 4th of September. I was no longer a slave, but I was hardly a free man. I spent the first 3 years of my life, actually, once I arrived in New York City, and I made contact with Anna Murray, and when she realized that I was safely in the hands of the abolitionists in that city, she came quickly, and on the 14th of September 1838, Anna Murray and I were married by the Reverend James W.C. Pennington. We were directed by the abolitionists to go to the city of New Bedford, Massachusetts, which we did. We spent the next 3 years there. I was able to get work for the first time in my life. I was able to earn money and keep it myself without having to give it back to my master or anyone else. And in 1841, I had the opportunity to take a 2-day vacation or leisure time to go to the island of Nantucket. And there I heard Mr. William Lloyd Garrison speaking. Mr. William C. Coffin, who lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts, knew me. And he asked me if I would be willing to get up and talk to the audience there and describe my life as a slave. And I must say that those words that I said that night, Mr. President, are probably the only words I've ever mentioned or ever used that I have no idea what I said. I was so nervous I could hardly stand up. But that began what became a lifetime work, working for the abolitionist cause and bringing about an end to slavery and trying to bring justice and equality for all people, particularly black men, black women, and white women, all women for that matter. In any case, in 1848, I had the privilege of attending the Seneca Falls Convention of Women's Rights. There were about 300 ladies there. Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the founder or the creator of that meeting, wanted all the ladies to sign the Declaration of Sentiments, demanding their rights as members of the human family. Most of the ladies who were there decided that was not a good idea. Mrs. Lucretia Mott, she said to her, "Lizzie, you're going to make us look foolish." And at one point, Mrs. Stanton asked me if I would address that group. I was one of only 2 men who spoke that afternoon. The other one was Mr. James Mott, because he was Mrs. Lucretia Mott's husband, and he had been the man who had been asked to chair the meeting, because it was not considered proper for a woman to chair any kind of a meeting, whether it was women or men, didn't matter. And so what I basically said to them was that if you do not take a stand for what you claim you believe in, no one will take you seriously. And I think that those are not the only remarks, but there were many, many comments made, particularly by Mrs. Stanton, and ultimately all the ladies and all the men who were there signed that document. And in trying to make this very, very brief if I can, in 1850, Mr. President, we had the new Missouri Compromise passed. 1852, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which made all American citizens literally slave hunters. 1854, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which extended slavery to every state in this country. 1857, 3 years later, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Roger Brooke Tawney, declared in his decision that he read that the black man has no rights the white man is bound to respect. A year later, a man by the name of John Brown visited my home in Rochester, New York. I had no idea what he was planning, but when he called me to meet with him in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, in August of 1859, I thought I was just going to go there and say hello and leave. It turned out he was planning on attacking the United States government at Harper's Ferry. I tried to dissuade him from that, and I was unfortunately not able to do so. On the 2nd of December of that same year, after he'd been captured, Captain, or maybe it was Colonel, I'm not quite sure, and I think it was Colonel Robert E. Lee, since famous as the Confederate General Lee. He was hung at Charlestown, Virginia, the 2nd of December, 1859. And within about a year after that, President Abraham Lincoln was elected, and South Carolina led the separation from the United States of 10 other states. And the war began on the 14th of April, 1861, when Fort Sumter was attacked. It's interesting, Mr. President, that I don't mean to necessarily bring up very unfortunate and sad circumstances, but the 14th of April, when Fort Sumter was attacked, was the same date 4 years later when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at 10:15 p.m. that night. Also happened to be Good Friday. There are other things that took place after that, Mr. President, and I'll be very happy to share those with you if you want to know. But in the meantime, this is basically what happened from my time after you made your move from the realms of life here on this planet to other places that hopefully were much better.
I just need to let Mr. Douglass know he's answered the first 22 questions that I had for tonight.
I did not mean to do that.
And furthermore, if you will, Mr. Taylor, I thank you, Mr. Douglass, for sharing the answer to my question earlier with all of us here this evening. I cannot reply that I am pleased with what I have heard, and I think many of you well understand that. You certainly have shown what the future can bring, contrary, if you will, in my opinion, to the founding principles of our nation. So I thank you for that. I thank you, Mr. Taylor, for inviting us, and most importantly, for all of us thereby welcoming Mr. Frederick Douglass to our retreat, Poplar Forest, and our city of Lynchburg.
It's been a beautiful place to be. Thank you. Thank you.
So, Mr. Douglass, could you tell us a little about your life as a child, as a slave, as a young man, and how you went from an enslaved person to a renowned abolitionist, a banker, a newspaper publisher, occasional preacher, and a U.S. Marshal?
How many days do you have, Mr. Taylor? I will try to make this briefer than what I just did. I was born on Maryland's Eastern Shore in the cabin of my grandmother and my grandfather. My mother, Harriet Bailey. Within about 2 days or 3 days after I was born, she was taken away by our master to the plantation to work at someplace else. And so I spent the first 6 years of my life being raised by my grandmother and my grandfather. Grandmary Betsy was a wonderful lady. She used to go for walks and take me with her. And she was she was highly respected in our neighborhood. She was able to heal people with herbs. She was able to repair certain things. So she made a little bit of a living for herself. My grandfather, Grandpa Isaac, was a free man. I have no idea how he became free. No one ever told me. But it's interesting to me as I think back on it that he chose, rather than leaving and going someplace where he'd be safe without any problems, or fewer problems rather, he chose to stay with my grandmother, who was a slave. And I've seen that kind of thing occur on more than one occasion among slaves in the years that I spent. When I was 6, my grandmother took me to the plantation. I did not know that that's what she had been told to do by our master, but I thought I was going for a nice long walk. But by the afternoon, and I'd been walking for maybe 8 or 9 hours, I was exhausted. And every time I started to dangle and walk behind her, she'd reach down, pick me up, and carry him on her shoulders. We got to the plantation in the middle of the afternoon. I guess it was around 3 p.m. or thereabouts. And we were suddenly surrounded by all these children, these black children of all ages, running around, laughing at me, pointing at me and all. And I had no idea what was going on. My grandmother pointed out to me, my brother Perry, she said. I didn't know I had a brother Perry. She pointed out to me my sister Sarah and another sister Eliza. I had no idea I had sisters. I subsequently came to realize and learn that my mother had 2 more children after me. In any case, she wanted me to go and play with them. And as a little 6-year-old boy, as you can imagine, I was apprehensive to say the least. Because I didn't want to let her out of my sight for more than about a second and a half. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was be playing with other children and all of a sudden find out that she had left. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely what happened.
So you talked about your mother and your grandmother and your brothers and sisters. You didn't mention your father. Who was your father?
As near as we can figure and determine, our master was my father, Aaron Anthony.
So that begs the question I've been waiting 22 years to ask. Mr. President, what is your position on slave owners having relations with enslaved people? Do I need to repeat the question, Mr. President?
You can wait another 22 years. I have, and I beg your pardon, Mr. Douglass, I don't know whether you are familiar with the story, but I personally have never made a statement upon it in either writing or any statement publicly. And I have always been rather concerned that the question is asked of me. My concern being whether anyone is really thinking about the individual and the children's and then the family of which I am being addressed. Are they really thinking about them? Is there a respect for an individual and individuals who are not here this evening that would be able thereby to speak for themselves, speak directly for themselves? To realize, if you will, in the time that I have known Mr. Douglass, and I presume you would well understand later, the social proprieties, so very heavy, so very acute, to share what many know in the depths of their heart and emotion with society. The retaliations, the condensations upon individuals, the ignoring of particular individuals, how they would be received. Are they able to walk freely? To realize, if you will, as I'm sure you do, and many of us, that the laws of enslaving an individual in our nation are relative to the condition of the mother. Mother. The law. The laws. With a great respect to those to whom you're referring, I would rather that many become familiar with them, seek them out and talk with them, learn more about them, learn more about our families. Learn and do not forget that as I inherited all too quickly the estate of my father, the freeholdings of my father. He was a freeholder. He passed away when he was only 49 years of age in 1757 under the old regime, leaving my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. That I was the eldest son, and therefore to fall upon me the British laws of primogeniture, first genitor family, the eldest son in the family, to inherit directly all of his father's freeholdings. And I hope you well understand, that meant not only the land, it meant the families living thereupon. Families already that had known one and the other for several generations, my grandparents, both on father and mother's side. And thereby to realize, as I came into my majority, 21 years of age in 1764, still under the old regime, this was still secured by law, the laws of manumission allowing only one enslaved per year to be manumitted, set free, and only through an act of meritorious service unto the family. This was enacted in 1723. When you think to the point in which we declared our nation's independence, 1776, the number of enslaved, manumitted, here in Virginia during that more than 50 years, 16. We did not begin our nation from nothing. We have inherited. And our work is clearly before us. I beg your pardon, I presume I have not answered your question directly. And I beg your pardon, citizens, as well. But my concern, my deepest emotion upon this subject remains respect. Respect unto those of whom we may not be thinking.
I think that answered the question.
If I might just add one thing, Mr. President. In my experience when I was on the plantation of Colonel Edward Lloyd for those 6 years, and when I was back on the Eastern Shore working for my master as a field hand, I can say unequivocally that I would see very often the offspring of a master and a slave. And sometimes the feelings between the master and that slave were very deep. I would say that they were very real, and they were very true. And one of the things that was very hard to understand was how a man would have 2 or 3 children that he had by a slave living in the same proximity with his own family, his white family, his wife, and their children. And one of the things that I did witness very often, more often than I'd like to remember, is that those slave children who were the offspring of the master's wife would treat dreadfully. Those children were very, very badly treated, had very little sense of who they were. My conclusion is that this whole business of slavery and this having children by the master of a slave being only part of it, part of the whole system, was designed to support slavery. The idea was to destroy any sense of identity that you could have as a slave of who you were. Why else was my mother taken away 3 days after I was born? I saw her a total of maybe 5 times in my life. And I've written in my 3 autobiographies that when I learned that she had died, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions as I should probably have received at the death of a stranger. I did not know her, but I do remember one thing, and it is a source of great joy. I recall the last time I saw her when I was approximately 6 years of age. She came, of course, late at night. She had to work all day in the field. And then where I was staying at the time, in the cabin with my grandmother, was about a 12-mile walk. So she walked 12 miles after working all day in the fields to my grandmother's cabin. She came. She'd lie down next to me, I recall that. She'd hold me close to her. And that last time she came and she gave me a little small ginger cake that she had made. And as she gave it to me, she called me her little Valentine. Some people have told me, well, that must have been your birthday. You were born in February. I don't know that. But I like to think that it was probably true, or possibly true. And then she would leave, long before I awakened in the morning. Sometimes I thought it was a dream that she had been there. But that's the reality for a slave child growing up in this period of time, in this country's history. Maryland was an easier state, perhaps, than Georgia, or Florida, or Mississippi, but it was still a state of slavery. I just wanted to make that comment because I think it's important to understand what is the real purpose of this. Why do you keep slaves ignorant? Why do you keep families separated so they will never be able to identify that they have a reality under God?
So you mentioned women's rights a little while ago. Mm-hmm. Mr. President, you inherited Poplar Forest from your wife's father, is that correct?
That is correct.
So she didn't inherit it?
Well, it was part of my wife's dowry. It came with her in marriage. In fact, I have written my marriage, I thought doubled my comfort. But lamentably, when my father-in-law passed away, a year after we were married, he passed away in May 1773, but then I discovered that I had inherited a great deal of his debt. And that is where it began. And again, I make no excuses. Part of my wife's dowry were the property of those enslaved, which doubled, near tripled, the number that I had inherited from my father. Mr. Douglass, I could not help but think as I listened earlier to your reminiscence there of walking with your grandmother and coming into the scenario that you so eloquently described to us of the number of children who were playing about And you're somewhat shocked at seeing so many children and then recognizing one or two and being told further. I could not help but know that you would not see your grandmother again.
Well, that is the truth. I recall that I had been told by people several years later, actually when I was living in Baltimore, and before I escaped from slavery, that the master had simply turned her out when she was too old to do anything. Her job had been for many, many years, I perhaps was the last slave child she raised, to raise slave children. And when they were ready, at the age of 5 or 6, in my case, I think she delayed it as long as she possibly could, she received the word from the plantation that Captain Aaron Anthony wanted me there at the plantation to begin my work as a slave. And she delayed it, as I said. But the reality is that she was doing what she had been told to do, what she had been trained to do. And the slave children, I had no idea who they were, because the words brother and sister meant nothing to me. I'd never seen them before. I did not know about them. And ultimately, I found out much later on, years later, after the Civil War was fought, many years after your time, Mr. President. And my brother Perry, who had been in Texas when the war ended, he came to Rochester, New York, and lived in my family for several months. And that was the first time that I had an opportunity to speak with someone close to me, a kin, who could tell me something about my mother, things that I did not know. It was a wonderful experience to find out this, that, and the other thing. I never saw my sister Sarah or Eliza again. I never knew Kitty or Ariana, who were born after me. But I must say that in terms of understanding and coming to a recognition of what it is to be a child, I probably learned more in watching my wife Anna and raising our children, the way she treated them, how she handled them, how she disciplined them. You should know my wife Anna was a very strong disciplinarian, very strong.
Let's change the subject. Let's go to a happier topic. Mr. Jefferson, July 4th is a very important day for you, isn't it?
Well, I think Mr. Adams might disagree with you upon that. Mr. Douglass, July 4th, of course, was the day that the new Congress of our nation voted in favor of our Declaration of American Independence. We actually had voted on independency 2 days earlier, and that is why John Adams has always said that we must never forget the 2nd of July as the true birthday of our nation, to remind ourselves every year with masked bands, bonfires, parades, and illuminations. And yet, of course, our concern was that the family man across the globe, the rest of the world, would understand what we were doing not only on behalf of ourselves, but for the rest of humanity upon the globe. And that was the purpose of drafting our Declaration of American Independence. The purpose, if you will, of following the vote for independency with argument and debate so that we could vote on our declaration. I'm not going to say that I look so much with pleasure as to the final draft of our declaration that was voted on that afternoon of the 4th of July. And Mr. Douglass, I'm wondering whether you've heard this. You know, the vote for independency was not unanimous. It was not. Anyone here, do you know which particular former colony abstained, held out? New York, New York. Mr. Lewis Morris said that he would have to return to New York, receive further instructions. And remember, this was all part of the parliamentary procedure into which we were born as Englishmen, the rule of the law. And so therefore, realizing that we had the quorum, that we had the majority, that indeed our vote for independency was successful, we then knew now before us was the argument and debate to vote on our declaration. And before that began, yes, I will use names. Mr. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina stood up and said, South Carolina moves that the ultimate result of the debate upon the declaration must be unanimous. He was seconded by Dr. Lyman Hall of Georgia. And so our debate began. And we argued and debated through the 3rd and commenced so on the morning of the 4th. And here I thought all would be resolved in what the committee of 5 men had drawn together as the final draft to be presented to the larger delegate body, when suddenly Mr. Rutledge stood up and said, South Carolina moves so long as one particular clause amongst our grievances remains, she will not vote on the declaration, and he was seconded by Dr. Lyman Hall of Georgia. Citizens, Mr. Douglass, Mr. Taylor, you know, this is politics as usual. I got up and walked out. Many have said over the years, Mr. Jefferson, why did you not stand there and argue and defend what you had written? You knew well what they are objecting to. Anyone here know? The clause that I had written amongst our grievances, the declaration is written in 3 parts. The first part, pronouncing the inalienable right of every individual to self-government and equal and exact justice. The second part is a reflection, a reminder of all of the grievances for which we never received redress. And be mindful, too, we were guaranteed as Englishmen, but we had the right to petition for redress of grievances. But do you recall? It never went anywhere. We could petition till the cows would come home. We were not represented in Parliament. We had no representation. And so read that second part and reacquaint yourself with what can happen if we forget of all of the indecencies and denial of equal and exact justice and proper representation and that inherent right of self-government. They objected to the fact that I had written, the king is indeed a tyrant for ignoring our petitions, the ending importation of slaves, for capturing a poor people, drawing them halfway about the globe, subjecting them to indentured servitude for life, waging cruel war upon a people who never did him any harm. Citizens, I could not stand and argue or debate. I have already referred to the reason. Proper parliamentary procedure, the rule of the law. My work was over with the first draft. I turned it to the committee. It was their work. Yes, I will not deny much was mutilated, emasculated, but that was their work, and that was done when the 5 turned our declaration over to the larger delegate body. When I returned, that clause was struck in order to maintain political unanimity.
Mr. Douglass, you apparently have nothing but scorn for July 4th, don't you?
For July 5th? Yeah,
well, no. You were asked to give a July 4th address.
Well, I was asked to give a 4th of July address in Rochester, New York,
yes,
by the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society in 1852. And I told them that I would not do that because what it stood for, freedom, liberty, opportunity, justice, was not present the way it should have been.
I just want to say, this was written in the papers, and I've read it. The 4th of July is yours, not mine.
Correct.
You may rejoice, but I must mourn.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Those are only part of some of the words that I said in that 5th of July speech, because I would not do it on the 4th. And that was my protest against the hypocrisy of this nation, which could dare to celebrate liberty, justice, freedom, opportunity. At the same time, it was denying that same opportunity, justice, liberty, and freedom to more than 3 million of its own citizens. I want to mention one thing, though, in regard to the Declaration of Independence, Mr. Jefferson, if I may. And that is, when I did learn how to read, and I should say read well, enough to be able to understand, I began to read that document, and I found it to be more than just a number of words written on a piece of parchment. I considered it then, when I began to study it and meditate on it, and to this very day I still consider it to be a sacred document. It was inspired. I don't know that it was some angel came down and touched you on the shoulder, Mr. President. I don't know. It's none of my business if that happened or not. What I do know is that it is a powerful document demanding what this nation was founded to be. And then when you add to that what took place a few years later with the passing of the Constitution of the United States. These are the founding documents that make all of us demand that we live up to our standards on a daily basis. One thing that I have learned, Mr. President, is that liberty cannot be just assumed to be there because I wake up tomorrow morning. It is something that I must fight for every single day, because if I take my eye off of it for 1 second, it'll disappear. That is the means, that is the understanding, that is the way I have looked at my life ever since I was able to understand what I was reading, namely that declaration. It was a declaration like of sentiments, as the women wrote in 1848, or Mr. Stanton wrote, but it was a declaration of independence. Our independence not only from England, our independence not only from a policy that does not allow us to breathe, to live, to pursue that happiness that you included in that document. These are very, very important.
The quote in the paper was that they said, you said, was abolish slavery tomorrow, and not one sentence or syllable of this needs to be altered.
Of what?
Not one sentence or syllable of this needs to be altered.
Yes, I did. Somebody did want to print it up, and I did insist upon that. If you're going to read it, if you're going to print it up, I want it to be the way I read it and the way I did it, the way I wrote it myself.
Well, in another speech in 1857, you said there is no struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. The power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. That was in 1857, just
August 4th in Canandaigua, New York. Yes,
that's correct.
West Indies Emancipation Day, a day we celebrated for many, many years.
Did you see the Civil War coming? It was just 4 years later.
I had met John Brown in 1848 at his home in Springfield, Massachusetts. The 1850s were a very difficult time for those of us who were supporting the abolitionist cause. As I mentioned a few moments ago, 1850 was the passage of the Missouri Compromise. 2 years later, the Fugitive Slave Act. Do any of you know what was in that Fugitive Slave Act? A judge would be paid $10 if he could return a slave to slavery. He received $5 if all he could do was arrest him. It made every single citizen of this nation a slave hunter. The American people did not ask for that. They were given that in that act that was passed by Congress. 54, slavery was extended to include all the current states in this union at that time. So, of course, Roger Brooke Tawney, when he said the black man has no rights, the white man is bound to respect, he felt he was very comfortable in saying that. We did not think he should be comfortable. And then in 59, what John Brown did, what he did, it was very clear there was no way we could avoid it.
You've talked about John Brown, but you talk about other relationships you had with Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, Abraham Lincoln, and Mark Twain even.
Well, I want to ask you again how many hours you have, but no, I won't. The truth of the matter is Harriet Tubman was born the same year that I escaped from slavery, 1838. I wrote to her when Sarah Bradford, Mrs. Sarah Bradford, wrote her biography in the 1860s, shortly after the war ended. And I wrote to her and I said, other than John Brown, I know of no one who has done more to end slavery in this nation than you. She was an extraordinary woman. And when I learned years later that she had been beaten by her master, or her mistress rather, when she was about 9 or 10 years old and had ringing headaches for the rest of her life. And yet despite that, she was able to live way into her 90s, as I recall. I met the president, Abraham Lincoln, in 1863. I did not like him when he ran for president in 1860 and was elected in 61, or when he was inaugurated in 61. I thought that he was very, very slow, couldn't make up his mind. In fact, I was surprised that he hadn't been elected president. And I wrote many editorials about him, what I didn't like. He seemed very, very slow in coming around to talk, even wanting to talk about slavery, much less end it. And then Mr. George Stearns, who had been in the Army, was going to remain in it during the Civil War, he came to me and he suggested that I go and meet with President Lincoln. I was not all that happy to do so, but I figured we might as well try to do something if we can. And so, in August of 1863, I was ushered into the executive office building in Washington, D.C., and up to his office. And when I walked in, he was sitting down in a chair, and as you all know, he was very, very tall. And when I walked in, I could see his knees above his chair. When I walked in, as he stood up, I said, "Mr. Lincoln, my name is," he said, "I know who you are, Mr. Douglass. You do not like me." But the one thing that I realized within the next few seconds, and it did not take much longer than that, when I looked into his eyes, into his face, and I could see what 2 years of war had already done to him, and I realized why the American people loved him. Because he could be trusted. I would be willing to say, Mr. President, Mr. Jefferson, that is why you are highly regarded and respected as well. Trust is a very, very important, essential aspect of leadership. If you get it, you must hold on to it and cherish it and honor it. If you don't, you'll lose it and you'll never get it again. So I met him, and we had what I would say was a very cordial relationship. I had a great deal of admiration for him. And I think that he has done what he did in ending that war and being able to save this union so that we have an opportunity for true unity at some point in this nation's history. It hasn't happened yet, but I think it is a dream, and that is one of the things that is so important about the Declaration, to me, the Declaration of Independence, because it is a dream. And our job as young people, older people, as American citizens, is to defend and fight for, to achieve that dream. I believe that firmly. So whether or not some angel touched you on the shoulder or not is irrelevant to me, Mr. President.
Yeah. I don't know of what faith the angel would have been that would have touched my shoulders in that regard. But, Mr. Douglass, I will tell you this. Can you imagine what we are discussing in this comfort of the art of conversation amongst all of us here? Not just 2 or 3 words that are like a bite of sound. But a conversation, and to realize if our Declaration of American Independence had been law, of course it did not pertain to the enslaved. Of course, something more needed to be spoken on the 5th of July. Much of what we are discussing, I would have hoped by your time would have been moot points, but no, what you're saying, it was so deeply, deeply ingrained, and not overnight, for generations. And to think, too, that the number who were following our declaration, as President Washington referred to it, our promise, leaving monarchies, totalitarian and authoritarian governments with the promise to come here and hold the reins of self-government. What are they meeting when they arrived? It must have been startling. But the population we had already known for generations, centuries, red, white, and black. You know this. That is who we were. That is who we continue to be. All others arriving make us the more American as it ought to be. We become the more American every day. These are our founding principles and promises. With a system of government and laws, our Constitution, President Washington referred to as the guarantee of our promise. That as a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and our institutions grow as we grow as a people, particularly the recognition that the earth belongs to the living generation. You know this, the dead hold no power over us. I just thank you for this opportunity to be seated and civilly engage a conversation upon where we've been, our hopes, our aspirations, but most particularly the work still necessary of our American Revolution.
And being able to talk about it without going to arms as we have done so often in the past.
Well, let me ask you a question, final question, because so little time and so many topics. Do you have any advice for the citizens of our nation, for our audience here tonight, on how we should proceed as a country, together as a nation? Can we proceed together as a nation? And as you put it, do we still have the opportunity that we had 2 centuries ago?
If we can find ourselves taking a deep breath every time we hear something we don't like, that will help. If we recognize that what you said, Mr. President, about respect, it's an interesting thing to me to find that when you feel that you have been degraded, literally destroyed, which slavery, of course, tried to do, it's very difficult to think that there's anything happening tomorrow that will make it worthy for me to get out of bed or me to even go to bed tonight. We spend an awful lot of time wallowing in our pain and thinking that what happened to me this morning was the worst thing that's ever happened to any human being in the history of this planet or in the history of cosmos. The truth of the matter is that we have all gone through some kind of trial. I say to people very often, particularly young people, there is going to come a time in your life when everyone you know is going to disappoint you. Everyone. Your brother, your sister, your wife, your husband, your mother, your father. There will come a time when that happens. And when that does, what are you going to do? How are you going to go out of the house and go to work? How are you going to do this? How are you going to take care of your family? How are you going to do anything tomorrow if you're so distraught and destroyed because of what just happened to you? Because nobody else was there to help you. What are you going to do? Well, there's an old phrase that I've heard a long time ago. There's a little voice that speaks to all of us from within, here. It's sometimes referred to as the voice of conscience. Listen to that voice. If you can't hear it, and I'm speaking to myself now as I say this, ladies and gentlemen, if I cannot hear that still voice, it means I'm talking too loudly, or I'm talking too much. It's a very subtle voice, but it is unequivocal. It is always telling me the truth. So if I can't hear it, my job is to shut my mouth and listen carefully. If more of us were trained to do that from the early life, and were continuously by our leaders reminded to do that, so that we ourselves would realize that our leaders are doing the same thing they're asking us to do, we'll find that we'll be able to have that self-respect, which then becomes respect for your neighbor, whoever he or she may be. And that's the answer that I have come to conclude has to be done. We have to reach that point where we can truly respect ourselves. You get up and you look in a mirror, or whatever you have today. We had mirrors, a little piece of metal, you could see your face in it. There are many times when I was much younger, and occasionally even today, when I look in that mirror or that glass and I think to myself, I don't like what I'm looking at. Who do I have to blame? If the only person around me is my dog, I might want to complain to him. But I don't have him. He's gone to the other side as well. So I only have myself to deal with. That's the biggest challenge, I think.
Mr. President?
Oh, I cannot say one word more, even as an addendum to what Mr. Douglass has stated. It is but common sense and common decency.
Okay, now it's time for you to participate and ask your questions. Could we bring up the house lights a little bit more, please? And we have two locations down here in front and up top there on this side of the balcony. If you have a question, please go to one place or the other so you can be talked. Ms. Guy, I think you're in the back. We'll get to you. Young Matthew, I don't know if you have a question tonight, but you're not young anymore, so. Anyway, please try and keep your questions to one topic. No multiple 3-layer, 4-layer questions. No one has a question? Ms. Guy, can you go back to Ms. Guy in the very back there? She's going to be back over there in the front in just a minute, and we're going to go up top for the first person up in the balcony next. Ms. Guy?
Okay, I'm Deborah Guy from Columbus, Ohio, and my question actually deals with both gentlemen's service with the State Department and United States relations with the second oldest republic in the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Jefferson might have known it as Saint-Domingue, a French colony that later became Haiti due to a slave uprising. I'd like to hear a little bit about the evolution of our country's interests with Haiti, its delay in recognizing Haiti, and any efforts Mr. Douglass, as he served as ambassador to Haiti, was often thwarted by members of Benjamin Harrison's own administration. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to hear a little bit about what were we so afraid of in supporting our neighbor fellow republic.
I've given several speeches or lectures about the island of Haiti. I was planning on going to Haiti in 1861, the early spring. And then, of course, Fort Sumter happened, and I changed my mind. In point of fact, I had planned on moving my family there because it was a black republic. The 2.5 years that I served there in the State Department as the Minister and Consul General to Haiti were not easy, were not particularly pleasant. I found the Haitian people to be very, very friendly, very warm, very proud people. But at the same time, the United States government, the Navy, wanted to have a naval base in Port-au-Prince. And I was trying to do things as diplomatically or perhaps politically I could. That was probably a mistake. But in any case, because I was somewhat remiss in paying attention to all the things, the arrows that were being thrown against me, I wound up being accused of betraying my office, and ultimately I had to resign. Or I just simply resigned. And at the same time, I was getting older, and I thought, well, it's time for me to go home and remain there. I had no idea that I was going to continue to be doing things after that. But I think the main reason why we have had a difficult time in this nation dealing with the island or the Republic of Haiti has to do with the fact that it is a black republic. It is run by black men. And our racism in this nation has never been eliminated. People like to think that maybe if I don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. We all know that that's a lie to ourselves. We must confront these things, as you did, Mr. President, with the Declaration and so many other things. You have to face these things that you think you don't like. But in those speeches that I gave, one in Chicago at the Haitian Pavilion, incidentally, you may not know this, in 1893, when we had the World's Colombian Exposition, the World's Fair, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's discovering America, actually Hispaniola. But I spoke there, and the fair was scheduled to open on the 1st of January, 1893. No other country was ready to open with their pavilion, except one. Can you guess which one was ready? Thank you. You can say it louder. It was Haiti, precisely. And I spoke there at their pavilion. And I said the same thing that I've just said here. Our problem with Haiti has to do with the fact that it is a republic run by black people.
Next question. I don't see anybody in the balcony, so Elise, if you'll let him go ahead there.
Well, I have a question, both a question for Mr. Douglass, but also a question for President Jefferson. And I will start with President Jefferson. When the Constitution was being resolved and written, there was the Great Compromise. And you also had expressed an opinion that slavery was a major question at the time this country was founded, and you weren't sure that now, at that time, was the time to address it. It would need to be addressed in 1 or 2 generations. In that regard, did you, and I apologize for not having reviewed your writings, but did you have a theory or a plan how that would occur in the generations that would follow?
Thank you, sir, for your question. And if you will, I may remind you, I was not here during the Constitutional Convention, held in Philadelphia, September of 1787. Anyone remember where I was?
Good friend.
I was enjoying 5 delightful years in La Belle, France, so I beg your pardon, I missed the 80s. I missed them entirely. And my concern remained thinking that the Articles of Confederation were of a venerable fabric, they ought not to be tampered with, but you yourself and everyone might recall, it did not have an efficient method to provide the taxation for the defense of our nation, nor did it have an efficient method for electing the chief magistrate of our nation. In fact, there were no chief magistrates of our nation. They were presidents of the Congress, and we had many. Now, I kept in constant correspondence with Mr. Madison. And yes, I will say that when he included what would become the final draft of the Constitution in a letter he wrote me, November 1787, I wrote back, I'm captivated by this. It is the shortest document of its kind in human history, creating a government to check its own power. And of the 3, you know that does not happen in monarchy, does it? Nor in any totalitarian or authoritarian government. Never forget that, my fellow Americans. And of the 3 branches, which branch is the most influential?
Executive.
Executive? Sir, that is an open invitation to an American king. You know that. It is not the executive, thank heaven. And remember, too, when you talk of term limits, for whatever reason, I'm hearing that more than usual here about term limits. Sir, thank heaven, the legislative is only 2 years. The next shortest term is the chief magistrate. It is the legislative body that is the most influential. That body elected by whom?
The people.
There it is. Now then, sir, what is the first line in our Constitution? We, the people. Again, my fellow Americans, there's never been another line like that at the beginning of any system of government in human history. We, the people. And talk about inherent rights, particularly the inherent right of self-government and equal and exact justice. Think about that first line personally. It's meant to be taken personally. Who here would think they are the less implied in that first line than another? I hear the argument and debate, are we a republic, are we a democracy? That first line is democracy. That's what we aspire to be. But yes, I'm not going to deny we're a republic, as Mr. Douglass has reminded us, as I knew well, as Dr. Franklin told us, a republic if we can keep it. That's how we began. But see, the point of the matter is, we've got to control that. We've got to keep that Constitution in the hands of the people. And so I wrote Mr. Madison, what is necessary for our Constitution, what all people upon the globe are entitled to, is a Bill of Rights. Mr. Madison wrote back to me. He said, oh, Mr. Jefferson, no, we do not need that. It's all inferred in the Constitution. Now, Mr. Madison is the most luminous mind I've ever known. He knows more of ancient history, what went wrong, what we can benefit from. Anyone know why he felt that it was all in the Constitution? Because of two reasons, sir. He said, when we begin to list the inherent rights of man, where do we begin and where do we end? Remember, there were over 276. And secondly, when we begin to list these rights, the argument begins. Well, do you mean to tell me there's no argument if we rest on inference? And who will always have the last word? The government in power. And so there it is, sir, firstly that, and then secondly, with that aspiration, sir, to provide those equal opportunities for everyone that our government can grow as we grow as a people. No, sir, it was those gathered in their coteries of property that felt what was necessary to secure them their property. First, speak it directly and clearly, 3/5 of an individual. And then to hold on to that, don't take the voice of the people as the final vote for the chief magistrate. We need an electoral system. An electoral system for two reasons: to maintain the enslaving of our fellow man, and secondly, the fear of the uneducated mob. There it is. Now I ask you, sir, if we are to eradicate slavery, and I am somewhat horrified to hear what it has taken to move in that direction, and I think many of you well understand, when I'd learned first of that Missouri Compromise back in 1820, I said, this is a fire bell in the night. This could signal the knell of our union. Does anyone see that speck on our horizon out west that can very easily fall upon us here in the east as a great tornado? I thank my Creator. I will not have to live and see this, because He knows all too well I will spend the rest of my life weeping over the neglect of the grandsons who have forgotten entirely the principles over which their grandfathers shed their blood in the American Revolution. That is only one generation. So if we can enable the people to be well educated, oh yes, because that nation which expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never shall be, and end slavery. I ask you, sir, what is the further need of that check for the power of an individual and their property? Because it does not properly enact the voice of a people and can someday become a blot on our Constitution, which will make its hit. No, sir, I have ever been in favor of whatever it can take to end this barbarous practice. It's inhumane practice. It's ill manners towards our fellow man. I've written that. And to hope that every individual in our nation will be a beacon light to the rest of the world, that man can burst forth from the monkish chains of ignorance and assume the reins of self-government. You know, Mr. Douglass, I'm interested to know that after July 1826, whether the franchise has opened up to the people. because I can tell you the last presidential election that I recall was 1824. It was the election of the son of my good friend, John Adams. But I wish to ask the company assembled here this evening, in 1824, whom in this room would not have had a vote in that election? Women. Who else? Not only the enslaved, anyone of color. Anyone of color. And that means those of a particular hue from a foreign land who have every right to come here and improve their condition, as you all, the natives of this land. Indeed, we still have British laws on the books of some of our states that define a mulatto to the third and fourth generation. Now, use your common sense. How can you tell? A white male, 21 years of age or older, who does not hold property, no vote, no voice. A white male, 21 years of age or older, who holds property but is mortgaged. I don't care to know who you are. But you know it's not your property. It's the property of your creditor, and your creditor could be a wealthy woman of color. She still does not have a vote. So the only one I have ever known, the only one I will ever know, to have a vote or a voice in our nation to change the law, to improve our Constitution through the amendments, not to break it, change it, through civil discourse, building consensus. The only one I will ever know is the white male freeholder, 21 years of age or older, and in our nation of a population 9,600,000, they represent less than 6%. I ask you, my fellow Americans, I ask you, sir, does that represent the first line in our Constitution? There's our work.
We have two more quick questions, but before we ask the balcony to go first and then down here, Mr. President, what was the population when you were president?
Population between 1801 and 1809 was little more than about 5 million.
That's correct. Mr. Douglass? Mr. Douglass, do you know how many what the population was in the 1860s?
There were about 4 million blacks in this country at that time. I would imagine a population. I was not really concerned about how many other folks. I was more concerned about how many blacks were still slaves.
Little over 35 million.
Sounds right.
And at the turn of the century, in 1900, there were 75 million. In 1950, there were 100 million. And dare I say it today, 330 million citizens in this country.
I can't count that far.
But that gives some idea of the situation and the discourse. There's an awful lot of people to talk to. Sir?
Thank you. I have a question for President Jefferson. Sir, I've spent most of my adult life trying to learn about your service to this country, and it's a life's work just trying to keep up with you. Thank you for that. And thank you for your explanation of what happened to the first draft of the Declaration. That helps a lot to understand the changes in the final edition. I was talking to a friend recently who we got into a debate. I had heard somewhere that at some point you had introduced before the Virginia legislature a measure to abolish slavery in the Commonwealth. Is that true, and whatever happened to that?
It is true, sir. At the time I was elected the second governor of the new Commonwealth of Virginia, that was in the spring of 1779. I was already on a committee with three other gentlemen, Mr. George Wythe, Thomas Ludwell Lee, and Mr. Edmund Pendleton, to revise the monarchical code under which we were born and grew up. We presented 126 revisals. Bill numbered 82, I remain proud of. That is the Bill for Religious Freedom, the first of its kind in human history, protecting and defending the freedom of the human mind, to hold your opinion upon religion or any subject as you choose, or hold no opinion upon the subject if you choose. That still protects and preserves the freedom of one's mind. Bill 21, coincidentally, as I referred to primogeniture and entail. Bill 21 dissolved primogeniture and entail, that which had benefited me. Was dissolved within 1 year. Bill 79, a universal system of education through our Commonwealth to be attended by the poor as well as the wealthy, the female as well as the male. It is Bill 51 that you are referring to. The bill to end the importation of slaves and to allow a master to free all of his people, to manumit all of his people, so long as he placed 25 Spanish milled dollars on the head of every enslaved. What support would there be? Who would believe that those so long enslaved would now walk freely wherever they should choose? No, it needed support. It was argued and debated a good 4 years. Finally passed at the time that I was commissioned to sail to France and succeed Dr. Franklin. Now, I'm happy to say that my good friend, Dr. Robert Carter of Williamsburg, Virginia, immediately freed 40 of his enslaved. 1 year, he followed it the next, freeing about as many. The third year, he was done with it. But he was one of the most wealthy individuals in all of the Commonwealth. He was the grandson of Robert King Carter, presumed by many to be the wealthiest individual in all of North America. And you would have hoped that many others would have followed suit. To think that even myself proposing that bill, seeing it enacted, land rich, but cash poor, as so many. No, sir, it had a reaction, a terrible reaction. Many began to purport amongst themselves that red-breeched radical revolutionary Jefferson is seeking to extricate my rightful property. It was repealed in various forms over the ensuing years.
In the back. And I see Matthew standing there, so we'll get him a question too. Go ahead.
Mr. Douglass, you're regarded as a great educator, forward thinker, one of the greatest orators that I've ever had pleasure to read. I would ask you, sir, to step forward out of your era as a forward-thinking person and imagine a time well into the future. You saw the 13th Amendment, but you didn't see the time when your descendants became full citizens of this country. With a Civil Rights Amendment, with a Voting Rights Amendment, we all know you couldn't be full citizens without unfettered right to vote. So that took quite a bit of time. So step forward from that with the civil conversation and people of conscience that you spoke of, and think about the educator in you. Tell me, sir, what would you think of a time when education stepped forward and then backwards into a time where learning about you, learning about slavery, learning about civil rights have now become subjects of law that you're not supposed to teach them? We can't learn about your descendants can't learn about you without it being some controversy. But we can learn about the descendants of Mr. Jefferson without controversy. So your descendants can't learn about who their forefathers are, but we are taught to learn about who Mr. Jefferson and those forefathers. How do you have a civil conversation about that? What would be your suggestions if you could step that far forward?
Well, I can probably imagine by stepping forward. I'm not sure I could do it in a very civil way. I would say this: I have written many times before, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. I believe that profoundly. Why was it so important to me at the age of 8 to hear Hugh Wall yelling at his wife, "If you teach a nigger to read, he will become discontented and unhappy"? I was 8. I understood those words. Discontented, yes, I was discontented. Unhappy, I had no idea what happiness was, except my grandmother. But when he added words to the effect that the abolitionists wanted slaves to learn how to read, and it was against the law, although it was not against the law in Maryland, it was custom, it was against the law in other states. I wanted to know why reading was so important. Why were they working so hard to prevent me from doing so? Sophia All taught me the alphabet. And I figured, well, I know the alphabet, so see if I can learn how to put some of these letters together. And so I wound up making all the little white boys on Alexander Street in Fells Point, Baltimore, my teachers. I'd walk up to them and I'd say, I can read better than you can. Now, they knew I was a slave. They were going to school. And they say, no, you can't. Prove it. So I grab a piece of chalk and I write down on the sidewalk, A, B, C, or whatever. And I say, look. They say, all you've done is written 3 or 4 letters. I said, I know a lot more letters than that. So I'd write all the letters that I knew. And he said, oh, goodness, that's great. Beautiful. I say, can you put these letters together in words? And over a period of months, I learned how to read. And then I purchased a book that was very popular at the time entitled The Colombian Orator, written by Caleb Bingham, a Vermont schoolmaster. It's a book that contains speeches, short dramatic pieces that he himself had written. Speeches of Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Washington, Benjamin Franklin. And I discovered in that book something that I would like to refer to as the power of the spoken word. The power of language, the English language. Speak it well. Don't slough your words in your mouth. Don't swallow them. Use the real English. They refer to it sometimes as the King's English. I don't want you to become a king. Just speak good English so I can understand what you're saying. And I can be heard without any kind of amplification such as you have there, sir. Learn how to read because it will teach you without any effort how to gain control over your own mind. And until your mind is free, your body never will be. I would say to these young people today, these middle-aged people, these older people, some of who are close to my age, learn how to think for yourself. That is why reading was abolished and prevented to the slave. They did not want him thinking for himself or herself. The only thing they thought that they wanted you to have was what the master wanted you to do. So the only way to avoid that is to gain control over your own mind. And then you become truly what Mr. Jefferson was asking all of us to do in approving that Constitution and that Declaration of Independence, to truly become free people. You cannot be free if you do not know how to read. And then once you learn how to read, the next step is even more critical. Learn how to write, and write well enough so that you can change the mind of this man or this lady. I don't mean to walk in front of the president.
Final question, Mr. Matthew.
I'll be brief. Both of you gentlemen have received criticism from colleagues and allies. Mr. Douglass, your willingness to engage in discussions with slave owners, and Mr. Jefferson, your colleagues would likely be astounded to learn that this discussion with Mr. Douglass had happened at all. So if I could just ask both of you to speak to what would your response be to these friends of yours, these colleagues who perhaps with good intentions would discourage you from engaging in discussions with those whose lived experiences are so vastly different from your own?
Mr. Adlin, I'd simply welcome them to join us this evening. And I mean that sincerely. To sit down with Mr. Douglass and myself, to express their concerns that you have just referred to it, to hear what they have to say. Every right to pronounce that and let their opinion be known. In fact, as I've written, I'd go to hell and back to protect the right of an individual to hold their opinion freely and to freely express it. So that is what I would endeavor to do, to invite them to sit with me. And yes, you're quite correct. You cannot begin to read for yourself and think for yourself without offending someone. But is that not all part of opening your mind? And recognizing in particular, no matter their difference of opinion, but as Americans, a difference of opinion must never be a difference of principle. And Socratic enlightenment and open and free inquiry is a principle of human freedom.
I would just like to cite one example for you, sir, in answer to your question. In 1877, I had an opportunity to return to the Eastern Shore to this small town of St. Michael's. And I was there on business for a variety of different reasons, but I received a gentleman who came to see me who told me that my old master, Thomas Auld, was on his deathbed, living here there in St. Michael's, and he wanted to know if I would come and visit him. When I arrived at the house, there were several reporters there. They wanted to know what Marshall Douglass, because I'd just been appointed Marshal by President Hayes, and they wanted to know what I was going to say to my old master. I had written him a number of years earlier. I was not particularly kind in that letter. But I said to them, and I'm grateful for this time that I listened to my inner voice. And I said, well, what I have to say will be between Mr. Auld and myself. And it will remain so. And I walked in, and he was suffering from the palsy. He was very ill. And what happens frequently when you meet someone who is very old, about ready to make their pass on to the other side, and they are sick, frequently they will begin to shed tears. And he did. So I reached in and took my handkerchief and I dabbed his eyes. And then I sat down and we had a very, very positive, pleasant conversation. And I mentioned to him about the fact that I had believed for many, many years that he had turned my grandmother out and let her just fend for herself. And he said, oh, no, that's not true at all. She was not my slave, but I took care of her until she did herself pass on. And then he said to me, Frederick, I want you to know something. If I had been you, I would have done exactly what you did. Those were his words. And I said, well, Captain Auld, I want you to know it's not that I love Caesar less or Rome less. I love Caesar more. I wanted to be free. I wasn't running away from you. I was running away from slavery. It was a wonderful reconciliation after many, many decades. But to hear him tell me that he would have done exactly what I did was a confirmation that I had done the right thing. And it proves that when two people can sit down who may have opposite backgrounds and opposite opinions and opposite philosophies, sometimes it requires a moment of stress, such as that moment, for the two men to become, or the two people to become, truthfully honest with each other. And Douglass realized, although when he was a slave, he was known as Frederick Bailey, he realized that he had, in point of fact, forgiven Thomas Auld. And Thomas Auld realized that he had gained what President Jefferson says we all need to have, the respect for me as a man and not a former slave.
I think we all have a newfound respect for Frederick Douglass and Mr. President Thomas Jefferson. Our time is up. and we only touched on a few of the many, many topics. I would advise you to go and read about these two gentlemen. Any last words?
I think you shortened our time.